Vantassel or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Well, I hope you're doing well. I've been quite busy lately. Did a Rodent Academy here in Montana as part of my day job, and also been doing the pesticide education tour out in the western end of the state. So a lot of driving in a short amount of time, but certainly glad that that portion of my work is over, at least for a little while. I got some future traveling to do in the future, but very gratifying to be part of the Rodent Academy, and that was the first one we had here in our state, and the feedback was outstanding. So clearly, something I should have run sooner than what we did, but nevertheless, I guess better late than never, and glad to have that out. So we're hoping to launch another one here. Probably in a couple years. We'll probably do it in 2 years and maybe do a different academy next year. But we'll see. Maybe I need to get my mind changed. But some of our speakers needed to have enough lead time to get that done, and we're looking to probably move it beyond one day. But anyways, I hope your week has gone well. I just got back from my trip on the western end of the state, so I'm a little tired today, but I needed to, I'm running out of shows, and so I needed to gotta get something recorded real quick to get it off so Franklin can have it posted for Friday. Please take a few moments, if you would, subscribe to the channel, definitely ring the bell, and make sure you keep up to date. For those of you that don't like YouTube, you can definitely visit me over on Rumble. I always post the podcasts there as well. If you need to reach me, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. You can reach me there. I'd love to have comments, suggestions, yes, even criticisms of the show. Would appreciate any type of input that you might have to make the show better, because otherwise I'm just going to talk about things that interest me. All right, well, let me get right to it. So during the Rodent Academy that I attended, so I was a sponsor. I wasn't a presenter at this, and so we had other speakers come in, and I learned about something, and I was quite shocked. So I have it up here on the screen for you. It's called galvanic corrosion. Now, the gentleman who was doing the talk didn't use that word directly, as I recall, but nevertheless, this is the concept that he's referring to, and I've never heard of this before. And so I would suspect that some of you in my audience probably haven't heard of it either. So I thought it was important to kind of get this message out. This isn't going to be the end all and be all, so it's kind of basically an informative presentation to make you aware of this concept. I'm still needing to do more reading about it to kind of get a really better grasp of it, but I do have some foundational principles for you that just to keep in the back of your mind so that you don't make a big mistake. So why don't we get started with this right away? So what do we mean by the term galvanic corrosion? Now, those of you driving your vehicles and aren't able to see the screen here, galvanic is spelled Galvanic, and then, of course, the word corrosion. So we're dealing with metals here, where metal is beginning to degrade. Now, can be quite serious, as many of you in the wildlife control industry are getting involved in. You know that exclusion is becoming a very important part of the work. In fact, something that I tell many people getting into the business, I said the trapping is the easy part, or the working, getting animals out of the house is the easy part. What really the money is made in the exclusion and repairs. And so this is part of what that work is, and this is a danger for you to make sure that you don't make this mistake. So what galvanic corrosion is, it's the transfer. It's a very technical definition here, but bear with me. I'll try to untease it out for you, so hang on with me. It's the transfer of electrons from one material called the anode to another called the cathode. So the anode is considered the base metal, and the cathode would be considered more of the noble metal. And so the one is giving up electrons and another is receiving electrons. And that's what causes this corrosion. You're like, well, what? This is an electrical thing? Yeah, it's an electrical thing. And this occurs in the context of a liquid. So that's what aids it. So think of it like you put metal into salt water. Why? It corrodes faster, right? Because that metal is giving up, I guess, electrons in that liquid environment that's sort of eating away at that particular metal. But this could also occur when two metals are in contact with each other, particularly if they are metals that are far enough apart on the galvanic scale. So I know I've hit you with a lot here. So let me kind of try to explain this in another way. Galvanic corrosion occurs when three elements are in place. You have to have a metal, one metal that's going to give up electrons, another metal that's receiving electrons, in the context, in the presence of an electrolyte, which is typically a liquid that allows that aids in the transfer of these electrons. Now, you remember from high school science class, we have atoms, and around these atoms, you have the nucleus, and then the electrons are spinning around the nucleus. So that is what helps these electron exchanges occur when you create new molecules and compounds. Well, there's also the fact that metals are giving up electrons, and if they're giving up electrons, that's what's causing the metal to degrade. So how does this really impact us in the wildlife control industry, particularly those of you who are doing repairs? Well, let me kind of explain. The danger occurs, one of the dangers occurs, is when you mix two different metals so that they're in contact with each other. Now, it's not just any different metals. It's got to be metals that are far apart on what's called the galvanic corrosion scale. Now, you can go online and get these scales, do a little internet search, and there's a variety of these scales up here. And what it is they tell you which metals are more likely to give up an electron and which metals are more likely to receive an electron. The bottom line is it doesn't really matter that you memorize that. What you need to do is when you look at the scale, when two metals are far apart on the scale, and one publication I looked at said if it's more than half the scale apart, let me give an illustration here. We'll have magnesium. Magnesium is the top metal here. That's one that would give up an electron. And the bottommost one is platinum. Now, I know none of you are working with platinum, so let me pick something different. How about something made out of let's say chrome, okay, iron chrome. So magnesium and iron chrome are more than half the scale apart. And so if those two metals are touching one another in the presence of moisture, they're going to corrode each other because of this galvanic scale, this galvanic exchange that occurs. Now you're going to say, well, why do I care? It's going to take a long time for that to happen. Well, yeah, but maybe not as long as you think. So in some cases, it won't matter in a practical sense, perhaps, but what if you're using metals in areas where there's the possibility of rain getting in if those two metals, in other words, let's say you put a chromium screw through a magnesium plate, and it's in an area that gets moisture from rain. What happens is that screw is going to interact with the magnesium, causing it to decay, therefore allowing more moisture to get through that hole. And if you're doing something like that on a roof, for example, then you could have decay through that metal, and all of a sudden there's a hole there, and now water is pouring into your client's house. This is important, and it's something that you need to consider when you're working with various materials. And it even gets worse than that. You say, well, I'll try to keep things dry. Well, it's a little more complicated than even that, because if you're using caulk, and that's by caulk, we're using a term different than sealants. Caulks here tend to be much stiffer than sealants. Caulks are made of they fall into one of four types of four base polymers. And so caulk can either be made from a latex polymer or a polyurethane polymer, a rubber polymer, or a silicone polymer. Now, a lot of us in the industry have used silicone because it's flexible. It adheres to a lot of different surfaces. Within the silicone type polymers, there are two types. The first type is an acid cure caulk, and this can react with galvanized metals. The next type of silicone caulk uses what's called a neutral cure. So again, if you're using a silicone-based caulk with a galvanized metal and if the silicone type uses an acid cure, then you're using a product that's actually going to be eating away at the galvanized metal, and that will break down over time. So you can see this gets a little bit more complicated than just simply slapping some caulk and something on a metal and thinking you're good. You might be good, but you need to be thinking about what are the chemical reactions between these two materials that I'm using. Am I using the right types of metals? Am I using the right type of caulk? Am I using a neutral cure caulk? Or if I'm using an acid cure caulk, is the acid cure caulk going to react with the metal that I'm using with the caulk? Very important. So, when you're using caulk, be very careful when you're working with the following metals: zinc, aluminum, brass, or copper. Now, I mentioned copper last because some of us, of course, have used copper stuff-it. And copper stuff-it is made out of copper. So we have to be careful what type of caulk we're using with our copper stuff-it, because copper in particular can eat through certain kinds of caulks. So I wasn't aware of this when I was doing until recently, and so I would expect that many of you may not be aware of it either. And so I would love to get feedback from you. And so, like I said, this presentation that I got at the Rodent Academy that we had here was quite helpful. And just to be clear, this was not the new COA Rodent Academy. This was a Rodent Academy done by the Montana Department of Agriculture. So this was our own academy, and we had a lot of guests. We had several guest speakers and presenters in the hands-on portion, and it was great. But we were the hosts of I'm not acting in part of, just to be clear, I'm not acting in the part of Montana Department of Ag here. I'm just simply explaining to you where I learned some of these concepts and then did additional research on my own time to learn a little bit more about it, because I was quite stunned to see this and then realize this is a bigger deal than I thought. So be careful when you're using copper with certain caulks. So asking your hardware specialist, if you're talking to a manufacturing dealer, to make sure that when you're used whatever brand of caulk or sealant that you're using, again, caulk and sealant are two different things. Find out if there's going to be any chemical reaction to the metals that you're using. You're saying, Stephen, you're scaring me. What else can I do? Well, there's a few things you can do to help reduce the risk of having this galvanic corrosion problem. The first thing is to use like metals together. So you say, well, Stephen, I don't want to bother with that galvanic chart, that chart you had that you talked about. Then what you want to use is use aluminum with aluminum. So if you're having aluminum flashing to take care of a hole, then you want to make sure you're using aluminum screws. And to be careful with that. Or you use brass with brass or steel with steel. And so those are things you can do to help eliminate and reduce that type of galvanic corrosion issue. So like with like. Another thing you can do, and that is add insulation. If you have to use two different types of material that are going to be in contact with each other, then add some insulation between them. Now, I don't mean insulation in the sense of, the pink stuff, but some sort of barrier to keep those two different metals apart, whether it be a rubber washer, whether it be a pipe shoe. Paint could be something that would work. Again, paint's going to degrade, but it will provide some level of protection to keep those two pieces of metal from having contact with each other. Again, this is contact with each other in a what's called an electrolyte environment, which typically involves moisture. Of course, there's moisture in the air, so definitely think about that. So if you're in a situation where everything is dry, like inside of a house, where you're not going to have water, like rain on it, well, that will certainly slow the process, but it doesn't eliminate the problem of galvanic corrosion. It just slows it down because it's a dry environment, right? So if you're in a desert and it doesn't rain, well, then the galvanic issue is going to take longer for the electron exchange to occur. And then lastly, would be galvanizing. So when one metal is galvanized versus another, the zinc actually that's used in galvanizing actually is the one that gives up the electrons, and so it degrades without degrading the underlying metal that's been galvanized. So those were the ideas that were given me from the reading that I did. My bottom line here again is I don't want you to see this presentation as the end all be all on this particular subject. I just want you to be aware of it so that you can talk to your hardware supplier, your exclusion supplier, and make sure you commit yourself now, saying that you know what's going to work with what's going to work with what, and what you should be careful of. And maybe you need to purchase a different type of caulk, a different type of sealant, or make sure you train yourself and your workers to make sure that they're not mix and matching metals with one another, so that you don't have this galvanic corrosion problem, because it can come back in liability later and bite you in the butt. Definitely look it up online. There's a lot of material online. Again, I'm just giving you a sort of a thumbnail sketch, and I would love to get feedback from you for those of you that have more experience in this particular area. But like I said, I've been in the industry for a very long time, and this was the first time I ever recalled hearing it, and I wanted to pass this along to you so you don't have this to come and bite you in the butt legally, plus we don't want to harm our clients, to be sure. So you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to get your thoughts about this particular podcast or others, and would love to get your feedback on that. And so that's pretty much it for now. A little short show today, but you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Would love to hear from you, of course, if you have ideas for future shows. Perhaps you want to be interviewed on the show. Would love to hear from you, and we're always looking to get new information out to the public. I'm still working on the revision of my book here, so I'm just going to hold that up there. I got an excellent review, a very critical review, and I really appreciated that from a gentleman out of Canada. And I wanted to give him a little shout out there, and I'll be in touch with him, of course. So I'm hoping to get this out the door perhaps in January. I'm kind of waiting to see what the EPA does with some of the rodenticide rule changes that may be coming down the pike. One rumor is they might announce in early December. So I'd like to try to publish the book after that to see if there's some changes I need to make within the text. But nevertheless, it's coming. This is a review copy here that I've created, so it's not just some figment of my imagination. And so you don't think that it's coming. I just haven't quite got there yet for final publication. So again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.